On my 70th birthday, my own daughter handed me a cheap paper envelope across the dining table. Inside was a one-way economy plane ticket to a barren desert town in New Mexico. "Have a good flight," she said without a single trace of emotion, while her husband sat next to her and laughed out loud. I simply picked up the ticket and walked away without saying a word. They had absolutely no idea that just 2 months earlier I had quietly inherited $45 million. And they definitely did not know the brutal lesson I was about to teach them. Before I continue telling you this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who completely underestimated your worth. It always brings a warm smile to this old man's face to know which corner of the world is tuning in and what time of day it is for you. Now, let me take you back to exactly how this absolute nightmare began. I spent 40 long years working as an infrastructure engineer in the rainy city of Seattle. I poured concrete, I framed walls, and I built a solid, stable life from the ground up so my family would never have to experience the bitter sting of poverty. The absolute crown jewel of my life's work was the $1.2 million home in a quiet, upscale suburb. I built it with my own 2 hands. Every brick and every wooden beam held a cherished memory. I planned to spend my final years tending the garden and sitting on the back porch, enjoying the peace I had rightfully earned. But when my health took a slight dip last year, my daughter Rachel and her husband Derek moved in. They claimed they wanted to take care of me in my old age. They said it was their turn to support the man who gave them everything. Within 6 months, I was quietly moved out of the master bedroom and banished to the cramped guest room down the hall. I told myself it was fine. I told myself family required compromises and that a loving father should always accommodate his grown children. Then came the night of my 70th birthday. There was no cake. There were no candles. There was no warm embrace. There was just a tense, heavy silence hanging over the dinner table as Rachel slid a plain white envelope across the polished mahogany wood. I reached out with my calloused hands and opened it. Inside was a printed boarding pass, a one-way ticket on a budget airline heading to a remote, forgotten town in New Mexico. I stared at the thin paper, trying to process what I was looking at. I asked her what this was. Rachel did not even blink. She folded her hands on the table and looked at me with an icy calculation that sent a terrifying shiver down my spine. She said that my presence in the house was becoming a heavy burden. She claimed my old habits and my slow, quiet routine were stifling Derek's fast-paced tech startup lifestyle. She said they needed the space to entertain wealthy investors, and that having an old man shuffling around in the background in faded sweaters was completely ruining their corporate image. I turned my gaze to Derek. He was leaning back in my expensive dining chair, sipping a glass of expensive red wine I had paid for. He let out a soft, mocking laugh. He casually raised his wrist to check the time. The light caught the bright gold rim of his heavy Rolex watch. That watch was purchased using a $15,000 loan he literally begged me for 2 years ago. A loan he swore on his life to pay back within months, but somehow completely forgot about once the startup money dried up. Derek smirked and told me I should start packing immediately because my flight was scheduled for Tuesday morning, just 3 days away. He said he had already arranged for a cheap shared shuttle to take me to the airport so they would not have to interrupt their busy morning schedule to drive me. He spoke to me not as a father-in-law, not as the man who owned the very roof over his head, but as an annoying nuisance that was finally being taken out to the trash. The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I looked down at my hands again. Rough, scarred hands that had worked 70-hour weeks to pay for Rachel's college tuition, to pay for her extravagant wedding, to build this beautiful sanctuary. A wave of pure, raging fire flared in my chest, but I clamped it down. I swallowed my pride. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply nodded, stood up from the table, and walked away. I let them think they had won. I retreated into the tiny guest room and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. The room was barely large enough to fit a twin bed and a small dresser. I sat on the edge of the firm mattress in the dark, listening to the faint sounds of Rachel and Derek laughing in the living room downstairs. They were celebrating. They were toasting to my permanent departure. I laid back and stared at the blank ceiling. They thought I was just a clueless, tired old man who was too weak and too scared to fight back. They thought I would quietly board that cheap plane and rot away in some dusty medical facility in the desert while they lived like absolute kings in my home. But they were wrong. Very wrong. Hours passed in agonizing silence. The house finally grew quiet as midnight approached. I was just drifting off to a restless sleep when a strange noise jarred me awake. I sat up perfectly still, holding my breath. It was a heavy metallic scraping sound vibrating through the floorboards. It was coming directly from the dark basement. My heart began to hammer fiercely in my chest. I knew every single inch of this house. I knew exactly what was down there. Hidden beneath a heavy rug and bolted directly into the solid concrete foundation was my old floor safe. It was the safe where I kept my most vital financial documents, including the original deed to the house. The scraping sound grew much louder, followed by the distinct sharp thud of a heavy iron tool hitting solid concrete. They were not just kicking me out. They were trying to break into my safe in the middle of the night. I realized then that my own daughter was robbing me blind. This was no longer just a familial dispute. This was an outright declaration of war. I sat perfectly still on the edge of the guest bed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The grinding thud from the basement echoed through the floorboards. It was a deliberate, violent sound. I knew the acoustics of this house better than anyone. I poured the foundation. I framed the walls. I knew exactly what that sound meant. Someone was striking solid concrete with heavy iron. I slowly pushed myself up from the mattress, ignoring the dull ache in my knees. I did not bother to put on my slippers. I needed to be completely silent. The hardwood floor felt like ice against my bare feet as I crept out of the bedroom and into the dark hallway. The house was pitch black except for the pale moonlight filtering through the tall hallway windows. I moved with the practiced caution of a man who knew every creaky floorboard. I carefully hugged the wall, placing my weight on the reinforced joists, making absolutely no sound as I navigated toward the stairs. With every step I descended, the metallic scraping grew louder, more distinct. It was followed by the heavy, breathless grunting of a man exerting intense physical effort. I reached the bottom of the main staircase and pressed my back against the cold plaster wall near the basement door. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to let a sliver of harsh yellow utility light spill out onto the hallway tiles. I held my breath, leaned forward, and peered through the narrow opening. What I saw in that dimly lit space made the blood freeze in my veins. Derek was standing in the center of the basement, stripped down to a sweat-soaked undershirt. His designer dress shirt was carelessly tossed over a nearby folding chair. In his hands, he gripped a heavy steel crowbar. He raised it high above his shoulders and slammed it down with brutal force. Sparks flew as the forged iron struck the solid concrete floor. He was not just hitting random concrete. He was striking the precise location where my floor safe was deeply embedded. 30 years ago, when I first built this house, I designed that safe to be utterly impenetrable. I dug a deep cavity into the earth, laid a reinforced steel box, and poured 6 inches of high-density industrial concrete directly over it. It was meant to protect our family's most critical documents from fires, earthquakes, and thieves. Inside that steel vault lay the original, unencumbered deed to this $1.2 million home, along with my late wife's original wedding ring and our old insurance policies. Derek swung the crowbar again, cursing loudly, as the iron bounced off the high-grade cement. He was panting, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He was completely manic, driven by a desperate, greedy frenzy. He was trying to shatter the concrete shell to expose the locking mechanism. They had handed me a plane ticket just a few hours ago, pretending they simply wanted me out of their fast-paced lifestyle. But their true motive was laid bare right in front of my eyes. They needed me gone because they needed my assets, and they were trying to steal the physical deed to my home while I was trapped asleep upstairs. My fists clenched so tightly my fingernails dug into my palms. A dark, primal surge of fury rushed through my mind. I wanted to push that basement door wide open. I wanted to march down those wooden steps, confront that arrogant thief, and demand to know how he dared to tear apart the foundation of my home. I wanted to grab him by his collar and throw him out into the cold night. But the cold, analytical brain of an infrastructure engineer took over. I took a slow, silent breath and assessed the reality of the situation. I am a 70-year-old man. Derek is 42, standing 6 feet tall and wielding a heavy steel crowbar in a blind panic. If I went down there right now, the confrontation would immediately escalate into physical violence. In a closed basement with no witnesses and a desperate man holding a weapon, the outcome was dangerously unpredictable. More importantly, confronting him now would tip my hand. It would reveal that I knew exactly what they were doing, giving them the opportunity to change their tactics, invent a new lie, or accelerate their malicious plans. I realized that winning this war required absolute discipline. I had to let him swing his crowbar. I had to let him exhaust himself against the impenetrable concrete I poured decades ago. He was not going to break through that foundation tonight. It would take a commercial jackhammer and days of continuous labor to even crack the surface. I took one last look at Derek, watching him swing the iron bar one more futile time. Then I silently pulled away from the door crack. I retraced my steps, moving like a ghost through the dark hallway, gliding up the stairs and slipping quietly back into my tiny guest room. I locked the door with a soft, barely audible click and sat back down on the edge of the bed. I did not sleep a single wink for the rest of the night. I sat there in the dark, listening to the faint, pathetic sounds of Derek failing to breach my safe. With every muffled strike of his crowbar, my resolve hardened into solid steel. They had severely miscalculated. They thought my silence at the dinner table was a sign of weakness, a surrender to their cruelty. They had no idea it was the silence of a man calculating his counterattack. As the first pale rays of dawn began to creep through the window blinds, the noises from the basement ceased. I heard the heavy footsteps of Derek trudging up the stairs, defeated by his futile efforts. I waited another hour, letting the morning light fill the room. Then I slowly stood up, stretched my stiff muscles, and prepared myself for the next phase of the plan. I walked downstairs to the kitchen, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of an oblivious old man. I filled the coffee pot, turned on the machine, and sat at the head of the granite dining table. I rested my heavy, calloused hands on the cool surface, listening to the coffee brew, waiting patiently for my daughter and her husband to finally wake up and face me. I was not going to accuse them of their obvious, undeniable theft. That would be far too easy and entirely unfulfilling for the amount of pain they had caused me. Instead, I would employ a far more effective strategy. I was going to ask an innocent, simple question about the noise and watch them desperately scramble to construct a plausible lie. I wanted to look directly into Rachel's eyes and see exactly how deep her deception went. I sat there alone in the quiet, sunlit kitchen, slowly nursing my first warm cup of black coffee, completely calm, absolutely focused, and ready to watch them unknowingly dig their own graves. The morning sun crept across the granite countertops, illuminating the kitchen I had painstakingly remodeled 5 years ago. I sat at the head of the table, wrapping my hands around my mug of black coffee. The house was utterly silent, save for the dripping of the coffee maker. Every shadow, every scuff on the hardwood floor held a piece of my history. I listened closely. Soon the heavy thud of footsteps echoed from the upstairs hallway. Derek was awake. His dragging steps sounded exactly like a man who had spent the entire night waging a losing battle against industrial-grade concrete. Rachel appeared first, floating down the stairs in a pristine silk robe. She breezed into the kitchen, entirely ignoring my presence, and went straight for the refrigerator to pull out her expensive bottled water. Derek followed moments later. He looked miserable. His posture was slumped, his shoulders were stiff, and there was a fine layer of gray concrete dust clinging to the hem of his sweatpants. I noticed how he carefully kept his hands shoved deep into his pockets, likely hiding the fresh blisters from his frantic crowbar swinging. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to occupy the uncomfortable atmosphere. Finally, Rachel turned around. She plastered on that fake, hollow smile. "Good morning," she sang out, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Did you sleep well? You should start gathering your things today. We want your suitcases fully packed before the shuttle arrives on Tuesday." I set my mug down on the wooden table with a soft clink. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping it of any accusation or anger. "I slept all right," I replied slowly, "but I kept waking up. I heard heavy scraping coming from the basement last night. It sounded like someone was hitting the foundation with a hammer. The effect was instantaneous." Derek froze completely. The carton of milk he had pulled from the fridge slipped from his grasp, nearly crashing to the floor, before he clumsily caught it against his chest. His face drained of all color, and he shot a look of panic toward his wife. She rushed across the kitchen, knelt beside my chair, and wrapped her arms around my shoulders in a suffocating hug. "Oh, Daddy, I am so incredibly sorry that woke you up," she cooed, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. I could practically feel her forcing tears into her eyes. She pulled back just enough to look at me, her face the very picture of a concerned, devoted daughter. I blinked, maintaining the facade of a confused, innocent old man. "What was going on down there?" I asked, letting a slight tremor enter my voice. Rachel sighed heavily, wiping a non-existent tear from her cheek. "It is Derek," she whispered, casting a sympathetic glance at her husband, who was still standing rigidly by the refrigerator. "You know how much pressure he is under right now with his tech company. The investors are demanding so much of his time, and the stress is eating him alive. He has not been sleeping at all." Derek caught on to the narrative immediately. He rubbed the back of his neck and let out an exhausted sigh. "I am sorry, Victor," he mumbled, refusing to meet my eyes. "I just needed to burn off some steam. I could not sleep, so I went down to the basement to clear out some of the old junk. I am trying to make room to build a home gym. My doctor told me I need a physical outlet for my stress, or my blood pressure is going to put me in the hospital." Rachel squeezed my hand tightly. "We did not want to worry you, Daddy. Derek was just trying to pry up some of those rusty metal fixtures bolted to the floor so we can lay down rubber mats for his weights. We had no idea the noise was carrying up to the guest room. Please forgive us." I looked at Derek, taking in his bruised knuckles and his dusty clothes. The lie was brilliantly constructed. It was plausible, logical, and designed to make me feel guilty for questioning them. A home gym. A stressed entrepreneur trying to stay healthy. If I had not seen him swinging that crowbar directly at my floor safe, I might have actually believed their performance. I gave a slow, understanding nod. "I see," I murmured gently. "Well, you should be careful down there. The concrete is very old and thick. You could seriously hurt yourself trying to break it apart without the proper tools." "I will keep that in mind," he muttered, turning his back to pour his coffee. Rachel stroked my arm again, her fake tears miraculously drying up. Her tone shifted to one of gentle, patronizing reassurance. "And about the plane ticket last night," she said, her voice dropping to a soothing whisper. "I think you completely misunderstood our intentions. We are not kicking you out, Daddy. We would never do that to you." I raised an eyebrow, letting her continue to dig her hole. "That ticket is a gift," she insisted, smiling warmly. "The facility in New Mexico is a luxury sunny retreat. It is a premier wellness center specifically designed to help seniors with joint pain and arthritis. You have been complaining about your knees aching in this damp Seattle weather for months. I spent an absolute fortune to get you a spot there. It has hot springs, specialized physical therapy, and around-the-clock medical care. We just want you to relax and be pampered." She looked at me with such intense, fabricated love that it genuinely made my stomach turn. She was painting a picture of a desert paradise where I would be treated like royalty. It was the perfect gaslighting technique, completely erasing the cruel hostility she had displayed at the dinner table. She was framing my banishment as an act of profound filial devotion. I knew better. I knew there was no luxury spa waiting for me. I knew there was only a barren desert town, an isolated facility, and an effort to strip me of everything I owned. But the cardinal rule of survival is to never let your enemy know you are on to them. I let my shoulders slump, relaxing my posture. I offered her a soft, grateful smile. "I am sorry, sweetheart," I said, playing the part of the foolish, relieved father to absolute perfection. "I completely misunderstood." "Thank you. That is very thoughtful of you both." Rachel beamed with triumph. She kissed my cheek and stood up, clearly thrilled that she had so easily pacified the troublesome old man. "Of course, Daddy. We just want what is best for you. Now finish your coffee. I am going to go upstairs and start gathering some of your warmer clothes for the trip." She glided out of the kitchen, her silk robe trailing behind her. Derek grabbed his mug and scurried out right behind her, eager to escape my presence. I was left alone once again in the morning light. The quiet returned, but the air felt thick with deception. I picked up my mug and took a slow sip. The bitter taste of the coffee grounded me, keeping my mind sharp. I had successfully survived the first skirmish. I had fed them the bait, let them construct elaborate lies, and watched them stumble over their own greed. They felt secure. They felt victorious. They believed their plan was moving forward flawlessly. I turned my head and looked out the large bay window above the kitchen sink. The front lawn was bathed in the crisp morning sunlight. The neighborhood was completely still, typical for a quiet Sunday morning. But my eyes caught a sudden movement near the edge of my property line. A man was standing on the sidewalk, positioned perfectly to get a full, unobstructed view of the house. He was dressed in a sharp gray suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. He held a digital camera. He raised it, snapped photographs of the front exterior, and walked toward the side gate to photograph the perimeter. He was moving with the precise, deliberate focus of a professional evaluating a high-value asset. I slowly stood up from the table, taking a step closer to the glass, keeping my body completely hidden behind the heavy floral curtains. I carefully watched the stranger lower his camera and pull out a clipboard, jotting down frantic notes. He was definitely not a lost tourist. He was certainly not a neighbor simply taking a morning walk. He was a professional appraiser, completely confirming the dreadful, terrifying suspicion that had been gnawing at my gut since last night. They were not just trying to crack my physical safe down in the basement. They were already moving forward with a massive external scheme to completely liquidate my property without my knowledge. The dark wheels of their absolute betrayal were already fully in motion today. I stepped away from the kitchen window, forcing my breathing to remain perfectly steady and undeniably shallow. If I foolishly marched out the front door right now and demanded immediate answers, they would easily spin another complex web of intricate lies to thoroughly confuse me. I urgently needed to know exactly who that unfamiliar, professional-looking man was, and precisely what he was so carefully evaluating on my private property. I slowly walked over to the stainless steel kitchen sink and casually tied up the large black plastic garbage bag. The sudden crinkling, rustling noise immediately drew Rachel back into the bright kitchen. She looked at me with a remarkably sharp, highly suspicious glare, her fake affectionate smile faltering for just a brief fraction of a fleeting second before returning to its manufactured warmth. I simply told her I was just taking the heavy trash out to the front curb before the noisy municipal trucks arrived early tomorrow morning. She relaxed instantly, nodding dismissively, and went straight back to meticulously organizing her incredibly expensive herbal teas in the walk-in pantry. I firmly pushed open the heavy oak side door and stepped out into the beautifully crisp Seattle morning air. The lingering damp chill deeply seeped into my aging bones, but the pure adrenaline powerfully pumping through my active veins kept me completely focused on the crucial task at hand. I effortlessly hoisted the bulky garbage bag into the large green plastic bin and deliberately let the heavy lid slam shut with a very loud thud to perfectly sell the elaborate illusion. Then I quietly slipped around the perimeter of the brick garage, moving stealthily toward the manicured front lawn where I had clearly spotted the unknown stranger. The man in the sharp gray suit was definitely no longer standing on the public sidewalk. He had boldly crossed onto my private property and was purposefully making his way toward the tall cedar fence that separated the paved driveway from the quiet backyard. Suddenly, the wooden side door of the garage creaked open. Derek hastily stepped out, looking incredibly anxious and completely frantic. He had already changed out of his dusty concrete-covered workout sweatpants and was now wearing a crisp white designer polo shirt, though his erratic nervous energy was still completely overwhelmingly palpable. Derek quickly approached the unknown man in the suit. They quickly shook hands, but it was absolutely not a friendly, casual greeting between old acquaintances. It was remarkably stiff, terribly hurried, and highly transactional in its nature. They immediately stepped much closer together, their urgent voices drastically dropping to hushed, highly secretive whispers that effortlessly vanished into the gentle morning breeze. I knew I absolutely needed to hear exactly what they were saying. I frantically looked around for a secure, hidden vantage point and spotted the massive row of beautifully overgrown hydrangeas my beloved late wife had lovingly planted exactly 20 years ago. The incredibly thick, leafy green bushes formed a highly dense, wonderful natural barrier right along the edge of the concrete driveway. I slowly lowered my entire center of gravity, bravely ignoring the sharp, protesting ache shooting through my lower back, and carefully navigated my body behind the thick, protective foliage. The damp morning soil quickly soaked right through my thin cotton socks, but I remained perfectly, absolutely still, silently crouching, just a few short yards away from where the two nervous men were intensely speaking in heavily hushed tones. Their paranoid voices were far too low for my bare, aging ears to pick up clearly. The gentle morning breeze and the distant, constant hum of highway traffic completely masked their secret words. I quickly reached into the deep pocket of my wool slacks and pulled out my black smartphone. My wrinkled fingers were trembling slightly, absolutely not from the cold weather, but from the sheer, unbelievable magnitude of the terrible betrayal I was actively uncovering. I quickly navigated to the standard voice memo application on the bright screen. It was a handy feature Rachel had ironically taught me exactly how to use last year, back when she still falsely pretended to have immense patience for an old man learning complicated new technology. I gently tapped the bright red circular button to officially begin recording. I slowly, carefully raised my right hand, delicately slipping the sensitive microphone end of the phone through a small, narrow gap in the wet hydrangea leaves, pointing it directly at Derek and the mysterious stranger. I held my breath for what felt like an absolute never-ending eternity. I stood completely frozen in the damp garden dirt, my tired arm aching immensely from holding the rectangular phone perfectly rigidly still. I intensely watched as the man in the suit pulled out a very thick stack of formal legal papers from his premium leather briefcase and pointed to a specific highlighted line on the top page. Derek nodded vigorously, glancing nervously toward the main house to make absolutely sure no one was secretly watching them from the tinted windows. He hurriedly pulled a shiny silver pen from his pants pocket and signed something, immediately handing the wooden clipboard back to the man. The stranger securely tucked the signed papers away safely, gave a brisk professional nod, and walked briskly down the paved driveway toward a shiny black sedan parked on the public street. Derek stood there for a long, agonizing moment, letting out a remarkably long, incredibly heavy exhale that spoke absolute volumes about his guilt. He frantically ran his shaking hands over his pale face, looking exactly like a desperate man who had just narrowly escaped a roaring, burning building. Then he rapidly turned around and hurried back inside the dark, echoing garage. Once I clearly heard the heavy wooden door click shut securely, I finally lowered my severely aching arm. I carefully stopped the active recording on my phone and slipped the electronic device safely back into my deep pocket. I carefully backed out of the dense green bushes, gently brushing the damp leaves and dark dirt from my tailored trousers to deliberately leave no physical trace of my secret espionage. I quickly walked back around the large house, entered casually through the back kitchen door, and quietly made my way up the carpeted stairs. Rachel and Derek were entirely, blissfully occupied in the front living room, completely unaware that I had just successfully captured their secret illicit transaction on crystal-clear digital audio. I confidently stepped into my tiny, cramped guest room and locked the heavy door securely behind me. I sat down heavily on the edge of the firm bed and pulled the phone from my pocket. My bare, unassisted hearing was unfortunately not sharp enough to decipher the muffled whispers on the raw, unedited audio file. I reached over to the small wooden nightstand, picked up my expensive medical-grade hearing aids, and placed them securely into my ears. I connected the modern Bluetooth feature directly to my smartphone, a clever trick I had learned entirely on my own during long, lonely evenings. I confidently swiped the digital volume slider all the way up to its absolute maximum output. I took one final breath and pressed play. The tiny speaker of my phone suddenly crackled with the terribly sharp sound of static, followed immediately by the harsh rustling of damp hydrangea leaves, loudly rubbing against the sensitive internal microphone. I sat perfectly still on the edge of the firm mattress, gripping the device so tightly my knuckles turned entirely white. For the first few seconds, there was nothing but the heavy rush of morning wind blowing and the distant rhythmic hum of passing traffic. Then the voices broke through the interference. Derek spoke first, his tone uncharacteristically anxious, stripped of all its usual arrogant confidence. He asked a question, his words slightly muffled, but undeniably desperate. He wanted to know if the property value had met the necessary threshold to proceed with the financial transaction. The stranger quickly replied in a calm, highly professional baritone voice that resonated clearly through my advanced hearing aids. "The appraisal looks good," the man stated with absolute certainty. "As long as you have the power of attorney, we can finalize the reverse mortgage by Friday." A long, suffocating silence filled my cramped guest room as the sheer magnitude of those specific words crashed into my mind like a runaway freight train. A reverse mortgage. My brain, trained by decades of meticulous engineering and careful financial planning, instantly dissected the horrifying reality of their malicious scheme. I had paid off the heavy mortgage on this house exactly 15 years ago. I owned every single brick, every wooden joist, and every blade of grass, entirely free and clear of any debt. It was the ultimate financial security I had worked my entire adult life to achieve. Now my own flesh and blood was actively leveraging my pristine asset to secure a massive line of credit for himself and his wife. But the massive financial theft was not even the most terrifying part of that short recorded conversation. It was the mention of the power of attorney. I had never at any point in my 70 years of adult life signed over total legal control of my affairs to Rachel or her husband. I managed my own bank accounts, paid my own property taxes, and handled my own medical decisions with absolute unwavering independence. For Derek to present a power of attorney to a licensed financial appraiser meant only one terrifying thing. He had completely fabricated a legal document and deliberately forged my signature. It was an outright felony, a calculated act of criminal fraud designed to completely strip me of my autonomy. They were not merely trying to secure a fast loan to fund his failing startup company in the city. They were legally erasing my independence. By forging that specific document, they were essentially declaring to the financial world that Victor Caldwell was no longer capable of managing his own life. The pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped together with blinding, agonizing clarity. The sudden relocation to the tiny guest room, the constant patronizing tone, the sudden forced eviction to a remote facility in the New Mexico desert. They needed me physically out of the state, isolated, and entirely out of the picture so they could easily intercept the bank paperwork, sign the final mortgage documents, and successfully drain the equity from my home without any risk of me walking into a local bank branch on a weekday and uncovering their massive, unforgivable fraud. I sat on the bed for a very long time, letting the recording play on a continuous loop, until the battery life indicator on my phone dipped dangerously into the red warning zone. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel the familiar heavy weight of parental sorrow that usually accompanies a truly deep, agonizing familial disappointment. Instead, my chest filled with an incredibly cold, deeply analytical resolve. I was an infrastructure engineer. Whenever I encountered a severe structural failure, I did not waste my time crying over the broken concrete. I immediately set to work actively designing a stronger, far more incredibly resilient foundation to completely replace it. I quietly deleted the audio file from the voice memo application and securely backed it up to a hidden encrypted cloud server I had set up months ago. Then I stood up and began to pack my bags. I did not pack my good suits or my valuable personal documents. I specifically chose my oldest, most faded sweaters and a few worn pairs of trousers, packing them with deliberate, calculated care to fully complete the pathetic visual illusion. I deliberately packed a cheap, battered canvas suitcase I had purchased decades ago at a discount store. I was going to give them exactly the pathetic, defeated performance they expected from a discarded old man. I quietly spent the remainder of a very tense Sunday and the entirety of Monday completely isolated in that cramped room, only venturing downstairs for simple meals. Whenever I unexpectedly encountered Rachel or Derek in the bright kitchen, I maintained a blank, docile expression. I offered absolutely no resistance, asked absolutely no questions, and simply nodded silently whenever Rachel cheerfully reminded me to double-check my small packing list. Tuesday morning arrived with a thick, heavy layer of gray fog, hanging low over the wet Seattle streets. I stood near the front door, wearing a slightly oversized tan jacket and faded wool cap. I clutched the handle of my battered canvas suitcase, intentionally letting my shoulders slump forward to project an image of total physical submission. Right on schedule, a standard black sedan pulled up to the front curb. It was not a private car service or a comfortable airport shuttle. Derek had requested the cheapest, most basic economy rideshare option available on his smartphone app. He practically jogged over to me, eager to finalize my permanent removal from the premises. "Here we go, Victor," he announced briskly, grabbing the worn handle of my cheap suitcase without waiting for my response. He marched out the front door and forcefully shoved my luggage into the open trunk of the waiting car, slamming the metal lid down with unnecessary aggressive force. Rachel stepped out onto the front porch, wrapping her designer cardigan tightly against the damp morning chill. She walked over to me and offered a brief, entirely hollow embrace. "Have a wonderful time at the retreat, Daddy," she cooed brightly, her voice echoing loudly for the benefit of the curious neighbors who might be watching from their windows. "We will call you as soon as you get settled in down there." I did not return the hug. I simply offered a weak, non-committal nod and slowly climbed into the back seat of the rideshare vehicle. As I rolled the window down, Derek leaned in, flashing a bright, arrogant smile. "Have a great flight," he said dismissively. I stared directly into his lying eyes for one brief second before facing forward. The driver put the car into gear, and we slowly pulled away from the curb. I slowly looked back through the tinted rear window. Rachel and Derek were standing shoulder to shoulder on the wet driveway, gleefully waving their hands with manufactured enthusiasm as they successfully banished me from my own life. I watched the familiar silhouette of my home disappear behind the rain-slicked trees as the budget rideshare navigated the winding suburban streets. The damp Seattle fog clung to the windshield, mirroring the heavy atmosphere that had suffocated me for 6 months. The driver, a tired young man, kept his eyes fixed on the road, unaware of the massive familial betrayal unfolding behind us. My battered canvas suitcase rattled softly in the trunk. Derek had chosen the absolute cheapest transportation option available, a final petty insult to ensure my departure was uncomfortable. I sat in the worn back seat, listening to the hum of the tires against the wet asphalt. I counted the passing intersections. 1, 2, 3. As we reached the third block, safely out of sight from the manicured lawns of my neighborhood, I knew it was time to execute the first phase of my counterattack. I leaned forward and gently tapped the driver on his shoulder. He glanced at me through the rearview mirror, slightly startled. I reached into the inner pocket of my faded tan jacket and pulled out a crisp, brand-new $100 bill. I held it out where he could clearly see it. "Son," I said, keeping my voice smooth and perfectly calm. "I need to make a sudden change of plans. Cancel the route to the airport. I need you to take me to the financial district in downtown Seattle instead." The young man looked at the cash, then back at the road, with a hesitant expression. "Do not worry about the rideshare application," I added reassuringly. "Keep the meter running, mark the trip as completed when we arrive, and take this cash as a personal tip for your excellent discretion." He gave a quick nod and merged onto the highway. The drive took nearly 40 minutes through sluggish morning traffic. I used that time to mentally review the meticulous preparations I made during the agonizing hours of the previous night. While Rachel and Derek slept soundly, convinced of their victory, I had carefully positioned 3 high-definition motion-activated mini-cameras throughout the house. One was discreetly tucked behind decorative books on the living room shelf. Another was mounted high in the kitchen, disguised as a standard smoke detector. The third was magnetically attached to a rusted steel pipe directly above the concrete floor safe in the basement. They were entirely wireless, running on independent cellular data connections I established months prior. I was leaving the physical premises, but my eyes and ears remained inside. The vehicle smoothly pulled up to the grand entrance of a premier luxury hotel in the heart of downtown. A uniformed doorman stepped forward to open my door, his professional gaze briefly faltering at my faded clothing and battered suitcase. I confidently approached the marble reception desk. The lobby was a masterpiece of modern architecture, featuring towering pillars, crystal chandeliers, and the elegant scent of orchids. It was a world away from the miserable fate my daughter had purchased for me. The front desk clerk offered a practiced, polite greeting. I handed her a sleek black credit card linked to an offshore corporate account and a secondary piece of identification. I checked in under the alias of Richard Sterling. Within minutes, I was handed a heavy electronic key card and directed toward the private elevators. The suite was breathtakingly expansive, boasting panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the dark waters of the Puget Sound. I bypassed the luxurious leather sofas, walking directly to the solid oak desk near the window. I unzipped my cheap canvas suitcase. Beneath layers of moth-eaten sweaters lay a state-of-the-art, highly encrypted laptop computer. It was a stark contrast to the pathetic persona I had so carefully projected. I lifted the machine, placed it squarely on the desk, and powered it on. The glowing screen illuminated my face as I quickly typed in a complex password sequence to access my secured network. My heart beat with a steady thud as I launched the custom surveillance application. I clicked on the first designated camera feed. A high-definition image of my own living room instantly filled the screen, capturing every detail of the expensive furniture. I clicked the second feed, revealing the pristine kitchen countertops. Finally, I opened the third feed, verifying that the basement floor safe remained completely untouched since Derek's frantic attempt last night. The audio channels activated simultaneously, piping the ambient sounds of my home directly into the quiet hotel suite. I sat back in the ergonomic desk chair, letting out a long, measured exhale. I was completely invisible, yet I had total access to their private moments. It did not take long for the true nature of my family to reveal itself. Less than 20 minutes later, the front door swung open on the living room camera feed. Derek strutted into the room first, tossing his designer jacket carelessly over my favorite armchair. Rachel followed closely behind him, her face flushed with pure, unadulterated excitement. The fake, loving daughter persona evaporated entirely the moment my rideshare vehicle pulled away. She looked absolutely thrilled, practically vibrating with a toxic, triumphant energy. Derek walked straight to the custom wine cooler built into the kitchen island. I watched the second camera feed as he pulled out an expensive bottle of imported champagne I had received as a retirement gift. He grabbed 2 crystal flutes and marched back into the living room. Rachel was already sitting on the sofa, scrolling rapidly through her smartphone. Derek popped the cork with a loud bang that echoed sharply through my laptop speakers. He poured the bubbling liquid and handed a glass to my daughter. To a highly profitable future, he announced loudly, a sickening smirk plastered across his face. Rachel raised her glass, clinking it against his with a crisp sound. And to the permanent end of faded sweaters and old man smells in my pristine house, she replied, taking a satisfying sip. She leaned back and laughed, a cold, hollow sound that completely lacked any human empathy. "Can you believe how incredibly easy that was?" she asked, shaking her head. "He just took the ticket and left. He did not even argue. He is completely spineless. I genuinely thought we would have to force him into the car." Derek swallowed his champagne in one large gulp. "He is a pathetic relic, Rachel. But it does not matter anymore. The house is completely empty. The old fool is on his way to a chemical prison in the middle of nowhere, and by this time tomorrow, the appraiser will sign off on the final valuation. Once the bank clears the reverse mortgage paperwork, we will have enough liquid cash to pay off the immediate interest on my business loans and keep those aggressive debt collectors off our backs. We are officially in the clear." I sat in the luxurious hotel suite completely motionless. Hearing my own daughter gleefully celebrate my forced exile should have broken my heart into a million irreparable pieces. Any normal father would have completely collapsed under the crushing weight of that ultimate betrayal. But the man sitting in front of that laptop was no longer a forgiving father. The man in that chair was a seasoned, highly analytical engineer, watching a severely compromised structure prepare to collapse. Their arrogance was their greatest vulnerability. They were so blindly intoxicated by their perceived victory that they had absolutely no idea they were dancing directly on top of a massive active landmine. I reached over and picked up my heavy smartphone. I opened my encrypted contact list and slowly scrolled down to a specific name I had intentionally avoided calling for exactly 2 months. I looked at the video feed watching Derek pour Rachel another glass of champagne. They were blissfully celebrating the theft of a $1.2 million house, entirely oblivious to the staggering $45 million reality looming just over their heads. I pressed the green call button and lifted the device to my ear, listening to the steady ringing on the secure line. A sharp, incredibly professional female voice answered immediately. "Victor," the woman said, sounding both surprised and remarkably relieved. "I was wondering when you were finally going to call me back. Are you officially ready to proceed with the asset allocation?" I stared blankly out the hotel window. "Yes, Valerie," I replied, my voice as cold and unforgiving as the impending storm. "The trust fund plan is permanently canceled. I need you to hire the most aggressive corporate investigator money can buy. We have a massive hostile takeover to execute." I disconnected the secure line and placed the heavy smartphone flat on the solid oak desk. The quiet hum of the hotel ventilation system filled the expansive suite while I waited for Valerie to arrive. I did not move from my chair. I kept my eyes fixed on the live video feed streaming across my encrypted laptop screen. Rachel and Derek had finished their expensive champagne and were now carelessly packing my few remaining belongings from the guest room into cheap cardboard boxes, treating my entire existence like disposable trash. Their sheer arrogance was fascinating to observe from a safe distance. Less than an hour later, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through my heavy hotel door. I stood up, smoothed the front of my faded tan jacket, and let Valerie inside. She stepped into the luxurious suite carrying a thick leather briefcase, her sharp gray eyes immediately taking in my worn clothing and the cheap canvas suitcase sitting on the carpet. Valerie was a formidable wealth manager, a brilliant financial strategist I had trusted for nearly 2 decades. She did not ask unnecessary questions. She simply walked over to the desk, pulled out a sleek silver chair, and waited for my instructions. I sat down across from her and took a deep, stabilizing breath. To understand the sheer magnitude of the tactical shift I was about to order, one must understand the secret I had been fiercely guarding for the past 2 months. Exactly 60 days ago, I received a phone call from a high-profile estate attorney in Chicago. My oldest, dearest friend Warren Mitchell had quietly passed away in his sleep. 30 years ago, when Warren was facing absolute total bankruptcy, I had taken a massive personal risk, and quietly loaned him the exact capital he needed to save his struggling manufacturing firm. It was a private agreement between two honorable men. I never asked for a single penny in return, and I never brought it up again. But Warren never forgot. In his final will, he completely bypassed his distant relatives and transferred a staggering $45 million in premium high-yield tech stocks directly into my private portfolio. I had intentionally kept this massive financial windfall a complete secret from everyone, especially my daughter. My original plan, the one I had hired Valerie to meticulously construct, was to establish an ironclad generational trust fund for Rachel, ensuring her complete financial security long after I was gone. That plan is now permanently void, I stated, my voice echoing coldly through the quiet hotel suite. Valerie did not blink. She simply opened her leather briefcase, pulled out a gold pen, and placed a pristine legal pad on the desk. I turned my laptop screen toward her, navigating away from the live video feeds and opening the encrypted audio file I had recorded from the damp hydrangea bushes earlier that morning. Listen to this very carefully, I instructed. I pressed play, and the muffled, incredibly damning voices of Derek and the professional appraiser filled the room. Valerie listened intently as Derek confirmed the forged power of attorney and finalized the timeline for the fraudulent reverse mortgage. Her professional composure remained perfectly intact, but I saw her jaw tighten with absolute disgust. When the short recording finished, I closed the media player and looked her directly in the eye. They think I am a senile, defeated old man sitting on a miserable bus to a desert nursing home, I explained. They are actively stealing the absolute deed to my home right now, using my own forged signature to secure an illegal line of credit. Valerie slowly set her gold pen down on the legal pad. The implications of that audio recording were massive, and she instantly understood the exact legal and financial warfare I was preparing to unleash. Victor, she began, her tone meticulously measured and dangerously sharp. If we take this raw audio directly to the local police or file an immediate injunction, in family court it will become a very long, incredibly messy public spectacle. Derek will hire aggressive defense attorneys. They will claim the recording was obtained illegally, and they will drag your name through the mud for years. But she paused, a cold, calculating smile slowly spreading across her face. With the $45 million in highly liquid tech stocks currently sitting in your offshore portfolio, we do not need to rely on the slow, tedious grinding of the local family court system. We have the unprecedented capital to handle this entirely on a corporate level. We can bypass the emotional drama completely and absolutely crush him on a financial battlefield where he has zero defensive leverage. You have the power to destroy his entire world without ever stepping foot inside a traditional courtroom. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the solid oak desk. Explain the tactical approach, I demanded. Valerie opened a thick blue folder and pulled out a stack of heavily redacted financial reports. I have been quietly monitoring the broader market trends surrounding Derek and his highly publicized technology startup, she explained, tapping a sharp fingernail against the top document. He projects an image of massive success, driving expensive cars, and hosting lavish investor dinners. But the underlying reality is significantly different. His primary company has been silently hemorrhaging capital for the past 14 months. He has overextended his credit lines severely, mismanaged his initial venture capital, and alienated his core development team. He is absolutely desperate for a massive immediate cash injection to prevent a total catastrophic corporate collapse by the end of the current fiscal quarter. That is exactly why he is frantically trying to steal the equity out of your home. He needs your money to cover his massive corporate debts before his board of directors discovers the truth and officially ousts him. His entire professional reputation is hanging by a remarkably thin, terribly fragile thread. The sheer audacity of his scheme was staggering. He was not just stealing my home to fund a luxurious lifestyle. He was desperately trying to plug a massive sinking ship using my life savings as the fragile cork. I looked at the live video feed still running quietly in the background of my computer screen. Derek was now sitting on my expensive leather sofa, laughing as he tossed my favorite vintage wool sweater into a black plastic trash bag. My resolve hardened into an impenetrable wall of solid steel. I turned back to Valerie, my mind executing complex tactical maneuvers with absolute precision. "I do not want him merely arrested for petty real estate fraud," I stated, my voice dropping to a dangerous, unwavering register. "I want his entire corporate structure systematically dismantled piece by very small piece. I want you to hire the most ruthless, thorough corporate investigator money can buy. I want them to completely dissect his entire financial life, find every hidden debt, every toxic asset, every illegal shortcut he took to keep his pathetic company afloat. I want to buy his debt, leverage his failures, and take complete, undeniable ownership of his entire miserable world. Make no mistake, I will leave him with absolutely nothing by tomorrow." I lowered the phone and placed it on the desk, disconnecting the line with Valerie. The silence of the luxurious hotel suite rushed back in. Outside the windows, the Seattle afternoon was rapidly surrendering to a deep twilight. The city lights began to flicker to life, casting long shadows across the carpeting. I sat completely still in the darkness, refusing to turn on the brass lamp. Valerie was mobilizing her elite team of corporate investigators, deploying the vast resources of my newly acquired wealth to dismantle Derek and his fragile financial empire. The wheels of absolute retribution were now turning. While the professional mercenaries did their highly compensated work, I was left to sit in the suffocating quiet, anchored to the screen of my encrypted laptop. I had to bear witness to the immediate aftermath of my fabricated departure. I had to see how quickly my treacherous daughter and her desperate husband would move to erase my existence from the home I built with my own two hands. I leaned forward, the pale blue light of the computer monitor illuminating my tired face. I maximized the video feeds from the discrete cameras I had hidden the previous night. The first camera, mounted high above the living room bookshelf, provided a sweeping view of the main floor. The house appeared momentarily peaceful, bathed in the soft glow of the recessed lighting. But the deceptive tranquility was violently shattered just a few moments later. Heavy footsteps echoed up the stairs from the basement, followed by the high-pitched sound of Rachel laughing. It was not a warm or joyful sound. It was the sharp, grating cackle of a predator, intoxicated by its own perceived cleverness. They marched directly into the frame, completely oblivious to my silent presence. Derek was dragging a massive roll of heavy-duty black plastic garbage bags. He dropped the heavy roll onto my Persian rug with a loud thud. Rachel clapped her hands together, bouncing on the balls of her feet. She pointed a manicured finger toward the hallway that led to the master suite. It was the room I had shared with my beloved wife for over 40 years, a sacred space filled with irreplaceable memories. "Let us start in the master bedroom," Rachel commanded, her voice ringing with sickening enthusiasm. "I want every single trace of his depressing, outdated junk completely cleared out before the contractors arrive to measure for the new hardwood floors." Derek nodded obediently, tearing 2 large black plastic bags from the heavy roll and handing one to his wife. They disappeared down the hallway, stepping out of the living room camera view. I quickly switched my active feed, pulling up the hidden camera I had discreetly installed inside the master bedroom smoke detector. The high-definition lens captured the entire room. My heart tightened into a hard knot as I watched them invade my private sanctuary. Rachel immediately marched over to the large oak dresser, completely ignoring the framed photographs of our family vacations. With a swift, careless sweep of her arm, she knocked my carefully organized belongings directly into the black plastic bag. Old watches, sentimental tie clips, and cherished books cascaded into the dark void, treated as nothing more than worthless debris. Derek was equally ruthless, indiscriminately clearing out the spacious walk-in closet, dumping my tailored suits and comfortable sweaters into his own swelling garbage bag. They moved with a frantic energy, eager to wipe away the history of the man who had provided them with absolutely everything. Then the true, unforgivable desecration began. Rachel moved gracefully toward the large cedar hope chest resting at the foot of the bed. It was a beautiful handcrafted piece of furniture I had built for my late wife on our 10th anniversary. Rachel flipped the heavy wooden lid open, peering inside. She let out a loud theatrical sigh of absolute disgust. She reached down into the deep chest and pulled out a thick, beautifully patterned quilt. My breath hitched in my throat. My late wife had spent hundreds of hours meticulously stitching that quilt by hand, carefully weaving together vibrant patches of fabric that told the story of our happy life together. It was a masterpiece of devotion, a tangible manifestation of her enduring love. Rachel held the heavy fabric up, scrutinizing the intricate patchwork with a look of profound contempt. "This is absolutely hideous," she declared, her voice dripping with cruel mockery. "It smells exactly like an antique store and mothballs." She bunched the precious quilt into a tight ball and forcefully shoved it deep into the black garbage bag. She did not stop there. She reached back into the cedar chest, pulling out 3 more handmade blankets, tossing them ruthlessly into the trash alongside my discarded clothing. I sat paralyzed in my dark hotel room, my hands gripping the edge of the oak desk so tightly my joints began to pop. Watching my own flesh and blood violently desecrate the memory of her loving mother was an agony unlike anything I had ever experienced. But she was far from finished. Rachel marched over to the small display cabinet nestled in the corner of the bedroom. It housed a cherished collection of ceramic mugs my wife and I had faithfully collected from our various travels. Each fragile cup represented a beautiful memory, a quiet morning shared together in a distant city. Rachel opened the glass door, completely unbothered by the sentimental value radiating from the shelves. She grabbed my favorite mug, a chipped blue ceramic piece from our anniversary trip to the rugged coast of Maine. It was irreplaceable. Rachel let out another sharp laugh. "Look at this pathetic junk, Derek," she called out to her husband. "He cannot even afford a matching set of decent dishes." With a careless flick of her wrist, she tossed the ceramic mug directly into her black garbage bag. The sickening sound of shattering ceramic echoed sharply through the audio feed as the cup broke into jagged pieces against a discarded pair of heavy boots. Derek chuckled in response, clearly amused by her destructive behavior. "Just throw it all away, Rachel," he encouraged, tying a tight knot at the top of his overflowing plastic bag. "We are going to completely remodel this entire space into a modern master suite. We do not need any of this depressing garbage dragging down the property value." Rachel nodded enthusiastically, sweeping the remaining ceramic mugs from the wooden shelves. The continuous agonizing sound of shattering pottery filled my hotel room, creating a horrible symphony of total disrespect. They were methodically, happily erasing the beautiful legacy of the woman who had brought Rachel into this world. They were gleefully destroying the physical remnants of a loving marriage simply because it stood in the way of their selfish, insatiable greed. The emotional pain radiating through my chest was incredibly intense, a sharp, suffocating pressure that threatened to break my rigid composure. But as I watched them drag the heavy garbage bags out of my master bedroom, the agonizing sorrow abruptly vanished. It was entirely replaced by an incredibly pure, highly concentrated anger. It was a cold, calculating fury that completely overrode any lingering parental hesitation. They were no longer my family. They were hostile intruders occupying my property, and they needed to be systematically eradicated from my life. I watched the living room camera feed as they dragged the massive black bags toward the front door, leaving dark scuff marks across the hardwood floors. I had seen enough. I had witnessed the true, unvarnished darkness residing deeply within their corrupt souls. I reached out and closed the video application, plunging the hotel room back into total darkness, save for the pale glow of my computer desktop. I leaned back in my chair, staring blindly at the wallpaper, my mind rapidly calculating the precise trajectory of their impending ruin. Valerie and her elite team of ruthless investigators were out there right now, aggressively hunting for the necessary ammunition to completely sever Derek's corporate lifeline. Every second that passed brought them closer to absolute destruction. The silence of the hotel suite stretched on for exactly 3 more slow hours. The city outside my window grew completely dark, illuminated only by the sprawling grid of streetlights and passing headlights. I did not move. I did not order dinner. I simply sat there, waiting for the necessary intelligence to arrive. Suddenly, the very sharp, distinctive ping of an incoming email shattered the atmosphere of the room. My eyes darted to the corner of the laptop screen. An encrypted notification banner appeared indicating a highly confidential message from Valerie Reed. I moved the cursor and clicked the urgent notification, bringing the email server to the front. I scanned the sender information, confirming it was the private address of my wealth manager. Then my eyes locked onto the subject line. Urgent, Derek's financial liabilities and the New Mexico facility. I clicked the bold text of the subject line, my index finger pressing firmly against the smooth trackpad of my laptop. A heavily encrypted attachment materialized on the screen, bearing the official seal of the premier corporate investigation firm Valerie had retained just a few hours prior. The file was massive, containing hundreds of pages of meticulously gathered financial data, deeply buried bank statements, and hidden corporate records. Valerie immediately pulled her silver chair closer to the solid oak desk, her sharp gray eyes locking onto the glowing monitor with absolute, unwavering focus. I slowly opened the primary document, a highly detailed executive summary that promised to completely unravel the pathetic, fabricated life of my arrogant son-in-law. The sheer volume of information was staggering, but the investigators had brilliantly synthesized the chaotic data into a clear, undeniably horrifying narrative of absolute ruin. We began reading the first section, which focused entirely on the supposed technology startup Derek had been loudly boasting about for the past 4 years. He had always presented himself as a visionary entrepreneur, a brilliant mind on the verge of revolutionizing the software industry. He wore custom-tailored suits, drove leased luxury vehicles, and constantly hosted incredibly lavish dinners for prospective venture capitalists. However, the stark reality presented in the investigator's report revealed a completely different, deeply disturbing truth. The technology company was nothing more than an empty, hollow shell. There was absolutely no proprietary software in development. There were no actual engineers, no active coding servers, and no tangible product to sell. Derek had simply rented premium office space in a high-rise building, hired a few attractive receptionists to maintain appearances, and spent his entire day aggressively pitching a non-existent product to unsuspecting investors. Valerie leaned forward, her professional composure tightening into a mask of pure, concentrated disbelief as she analyzed the complex flow of capital. "This is not just a failed business venture," she stated, her voice remarkably low and chillingly serious. "This is a massive, meticulously structured Ponzi scheme." She pointed to a detailed flowchart, tracking millions of dollars moving rapidly between dozens of different offshore banking accounts. Derek had spent the last 3 years actively defrauding wealthy individuals. He would secure a massive initial investment promise, a guaranteed highly lucrative return, and then immediately use that fresh capital to fund his own extravagant personal lifestyle. When the original investors eventually demanded to see their promised profits, Derek would desperately hunt for new victims, using their fresh money to quietly pay off the older debts and keep the entire fraudulent operation afloat. It was a classic, devastatingly destructive cycle of financial manipulation, and it was entirely unsustainable. I stared at the screen, my mind rapidly processing the sheer scale of his incredible deception. Rachel had clearly been funding her endless shopping sprees, designer wardrobes, and luxury vacations with stolen, highly illegal money. But a Ponzi scheme of this magnitude always required a constant, massive influx of fresh capital to prevent a total collapse. According to the comprehensive timeline laid out by the elite investigators, the fragile house of cards had completely stopped taking in new money exactly 8 months ago. The well had finally run entirely dry. The wealthy investors had grown incredibly suspicious of his constant delays and fabricated excuses. They had firmly closed their checkbooks and started loudly demanding their money back. That was precisely when Derek had made a fatal, utterly catastrophic decision out of pure, blinding desperation. Unable to secure legitimate funding from reputable financial institutions, Derek had sought out incredibly dangerous, highly illegal alternative lending sources. Valerie scrolled down to the third section of the report, her eyes scanning the dark hidden underbelly of his financial liabilities. My blood ran completely cold as the terrifying truth finally revealed itself in stark, undeniable black and white text. Derek had borrowed capital from a ruthless syndicate of organized loan sharks. He had taken a series of massive undocumented loans at exorbitant predatory interest rates just to keep his angry investors momentarily pacified. The investigators had somehow managed to intercept a series of highly encrypted messages and unrecorded wire transfers that painted a picture of total, inescapable doom. Derek did not just owe a few $100,000. He was currently $10 million in debt to incredibly violent, deeply unforgiving criminals. The pieces of his frantic behavior suddenly made absolute sense. The syndicate had clearly grown tired of his endless empty promises and bounced checks. They had started applying severe targeted pressure. The heavy bags under his eyes, his sudden weight loss, the constant nervous sweating, and the desperate attack on my floor safe. Derek was a man out of time fighting for his very survival. He was scrambling to find any liquid asset to appease the violent men breathing down his neck. That was why he forged the legal power of attorney. That was why he was attempting to secure a reverse mortgage on my Seattle property. The $1.2 million he planned to steal from my home equity was never intended to fund a new business venture. It was a pathetic drop in the bucket, barely enough to cover the massive interest payments he owed to the syndicate for the current quarter. He was trying to buy himself a few more weeks of breathing room by sacrificing the only unencumbered asset left in the entire family. The audacity of his highly destructive plan was staggering. He was willing to strip an elderly man of his home and financial security just to delay his own violent reckoning. He was fully prepared to leave me completely homeless and entirely destitute while he continued to play the role of a wealthy entrepreneur. I felt a dark wave of fury wash over my body. It was a cold anger that eradicated any lingering shred of familial mercy I might have unknowingly harbored. He had brought violent criminals into our orbit. He had placed my home and legacy directly in the crosshairs of a ruthless criminal syndicate. Valerie continued to read the financial breakdowns, shaking her head in disbelief at the monumental scale of his reckless stupidity. "He is completely trapped," she murmured, scanning a complex table of accumulating interest penalties. "Even if he successfully stole the entire value of your property, it would not satisfy the principal balance of his illegal loans. The syndicate owns him completely. He has zero leverage, no assets, and no escape route. He is a walking dead man, frantically trying to drag everyone else down into the grave with him." She paused, letting out a long, slow exhale. "Victor," she said softly, looking up from the glowing screen, "we need to freeze all of your visible accounts immediately. We need to establish an impenetrable legal firewall between you and this massive criminal enterprise before the syndicate looks at his family for collateral repayment." I nodded slowly, calculating the necessary defensive maneuvers. "Do it," I commanded instantly. "Lock everything down. Ensure not a single penny of my legitimate wealth or the new tech stock portfolio can be traced back to his fraudulent activities. I want him entirely isolated on his sinking ship. He created this disaster, and he will face the unmitigated consequences of his actions alone." Valerie gave a firm nod, her fingers flying across her mobile device to initiate the lockdown. I knew my wealth would be completely invisible within the hour. We sat in the quiet room absorbing the heavy reality. The initial shock had somewhat faded, replaced by a grim determination. I had managed to escape their grasp just in time. If I had stayed in that house, Derek might have resorted to violent measures to secure the cash. He was a cornered animal capable of unimaginable cruelty. Valerie turned back to the glowing screen of my own laptop. She carefully navigated away from the complex financial charts and slowly scrolled down toward the final, highly anticipated section of the investigator's report. This dark section was exclusively dedicated to the mysterious luxury wellness facility located in the remote New Mexico desert. It was the exact place Rachel had cheerfully promised would be my ultimate peaceful sanctuary. I watched Valerie very closely as her sharp gray eyes scanned the opening paragraphs of the summary. Her calm, professional demeanor suddenly changed. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her incredibly pale. I could hear her breath hitch sharply in her throat, a genuine gasp of pure horror. Her hands, which had been so steady while dissecting the criminal debt, began to tremble over the keyboard. She completely stopped scrolling. She did not speak a word. The silence in the hotel suite became incredibly heavy, thick with an impending sense of absolute, unimaginable dread. I leaned slightly forward, my pulse quickening, sensing that the financial betrayal was merely the beginning of the nightmare. Valerie slowly turned her head and looked directly at me, her eyes wide with a terrifying, profound realization. Her voice trembled slightly as she slowly pushed the heavy laptop across the smooth surface of the solid oak desk. "Victor," she whispered, her tone completely stripped of its usual professional confidence. "You need to read this yourself. I cannot even bring myself to say these words out loud." I leaned forward, pulling the glowing screen toward my chest. The document on the screen detailed the background of the wellness retreat Rachel had supposedly booked for me. It was named the Sunridge Desert Haven, located deep in a highly isolated, desolate stretch of the barren New Mexico desert landscape. According to the glossy promotional materials carefully attached to the file, it was a premier rehabilitation facility catering exclusively to wealthy senior citizens. The colorful photographs displayed smiling residents lounging beside sparkling blue swimming pools and enjoying luxurious spa treatments. But the private investigator had completely bypassed the fraudulent marketing facade and aggressively dug into the dark, heavily redacted state regulatory records. The Sunridge Desert Haven was not a luxury retirement home or a peaceful physical therapy center. It was a heavily investigated, incredibly corrupt, locked-down psychiatric hold facility, operating entirely under a very dark, incredibly sinister legal loophole. My eyes scanned the horrifying text as a profound chill rapidly spread through my entire body. The facility was utterly notorious within obscure legal circles for accepting completely healthy, unwilling patients brought in by deeply greedy, highly manipulative family members. Once a vulnerable individual was physically checked into the remote building, the corrupt medical staff would immediately invoke an aggressive emergency psychiatric protocol. They systematically stripped every new resident of their basic communication rights. There were absolutely no personal cell phones allowed, no unmonitored landline calls permitted, and absolutely no unauthorized visitors granted access to the heavily fortified, isolated compound. The truly monstrous nature of their entire operation was meticulously documented by previous highly courageous whistleblowers. To guarantee complete compliance and physically prevent any desperate escape attempts, the institution aggressively dosed their captive patients with incredibly heavy, mind-altering, antipsychotic medications. The potent chemical cocktails were specifically designed to instantly induce a permanent state of severe, debilitating lethargy and deep cognitive confusion. They were actively creating the exact symptoms of advanced dementia in perfectly healthy adults. The terrified patients were essentially transformed into drooling, entirely helpless shadows of their former selves, completely incapable of formulating any coherent thoughts or sentences. My stomach violently churned as the true, unvarnished depth of Rachel's malevolent plan finally washed over my shocked mind. She had not simply picked a random, inconvenient location to safely store me while Derek systematically liquidated my immense financial assets. She had specifically, intentionally chosen a brutal chemical prison where my mind would be completely, deliberately erased. Once the strong medication rendered me entirely docile and completely unable to effectively speak for myself, Rachel would calmly step forward as the deeply concerned daughter. She would confidently use my sudden medically induced decline to definitively validate her forged power of attorney. It was a brilliantly terrifying strategy, designed to perfectly shield their massive theft behind a solid wall of seemingly legitimate medical authority. Any future investigation into the suspicious reverse mortgage would immediately hit an impenetrable dead end. The bank investigators would simply find a tragically incapacitated old man currently residing in a heavily secured psychiatric ward, entirely unable to confirm or deny any knowledge of the massive loan. My own daughter had coldly, ruthlessly orchestrated a plan to permanently lobotomize me, simply to completely cover the fraudulent tracks of her desperately failing, completely corrupt, and dangerously indebted, arrogant young husband. I slowly looked away from the brightly glowing laptop monitor, my breathing suddenly catching painfully in the very back of my dry throat. The profound, suffocating weight of this horrific revelation threatened to completely shatter my remaining composure. I had genuinely believed their ultimate goal was simply financial greed. I assumed they merely wanted my physical assets to maintain their entirely superficial, incredibly hollow Seattle lifestyle. But they actually wanted to permanently destroy my conscious mind. They were fully prepared to essentially murder my entire personality and forcibly lock me inside a bleak, lonely chemical prison until my eventual death. Valerie sat perfectly still across the dark table, her sharp gray eyes entirely focused on my incredibly tense, completely rigid facial expressions. She had spent 2 decades aggressively managing massive portfolios for the wealthiest, most powerful families in the entire Pacific Northwest. She had witnessed endless, ugly corporate battles and countless bitter, highly destructive inheritance disputes. But the pure, unadulterated evil radiating from this specific digital dossier clearly shocked even her deeply hardened, heavily fortified professional sensibilities. "Victor," she stated softly, her voice barely rising above a hushed, highly reverent whisper. "We are absolutely dealing with genuine, undeniable sociopaths here." I slowly closed my tired eyes forcefully, pushing away the lingering, deeply painful phantom memories of holding a precious, smiling baby girl in my warm arms so many happy decades ago. That sweet, innocent child was completely, permanently dead to me now. The ruthless, entirely hollow woman, actively wearing her stolen face, had just boldly attempted to effectively murder me without ever leaving a single visible bloody fingerprint. A profound, icy calmness suddenly settled deep within the very center of my rapidly beating chest. I opened my eyes, staring directly into Valerie's incredibly sharp, highly observant, and sympathetic gray gaze. "You were completely right earlier," I stated, my voice echoing with a dark, chillingly metallic resonance that perfectly matched the cold, industrial concrete I had poured so meticulously underneath my Seattle home. "We are absolutely not going to blindly rely on the hopelessly slow, entirely unpredictable local family court system to handle this unprecedented criminal betrayal. The standard legal justice system is far too gentle, far too forgiving for the specific type of absolute catastrophic ruin I now require. We are going to aggressively, systematically obliterate their entire miserable world using the absolute full, unyielding weight of my massive capital." Valerie sat perfectly straight, vigorously nodding her complete, unwavering professional agreement. She rapidly pulled out her encrypted smartphone and immediately began typing a series of highly secure, highly urgent messages to her elite team of ruthless financial mercenaries. "I want absolutely every single scrap of their hidden debt completely purchased by our offshore holding companies. Before midnight tonight," I commanded smoothly. "I want those violent, deeply unstable loan sharks permanently bought out and entirely removed from the active equation. Derek will no longer owe his massive, staggering financial obligations to anonymous violent thugs hiding in the dark Seattle criminal underworld. He will owe every single crushing, unpayable penny directly to me." I continued, my voice entirely devoid of any lingering human warmth. "Once we securely hold all of his massively overextended promissory notes, we will legally, ruthlessly collapse his entire hollow tech startup before the morning sun officially rises. We will loudly notify his remaining highly frustrated legitimate investors of his incredibly reckless, thoroughly illegal financial behavior. His carefully cultivated, totally fraudulent professional reputation will be violently, instantly eviscerated across the entire business community, He will be utterly unemployable, entirely bankrupt, and totally trapped beneath a mountain of impossible debt. Valerie finished executing the complex digital orders and placed her smartphone firmly onto the oak desk. "It is already done, Victor," she confirmed smoothly. "The heavily funded acquisition teams are actively securing the offshore corporate debt right now. By tomorrow afternoon, your treacherous son-in-law will effectively belong to your private holding company. He will have absolutely nowhere to run and absolutely no one left to desperately manipulate." I offered her a short, completely humorless nod. It was the precise, deeply satisfying feeling of dropping a heavy steel vault door directly onto the eager hands of a greedy thief. Just as Valerie securely snapped her premium leather briefcase completely shut, a very sudden, incredibly sharp electronic chime pierced the heavy silence of the dark hotel suite. It was the specific, highly distinct notification tone directly originating from my encrypted laptop computer. The advanced motion tracking software deeply embedded within my hidden residential surveillance system had successfully detected immediate, significant physical movement. I quickly spun my comfortable ergonomic chair directly toward the glowing monitor. The tiny camera, carefully hidden within the vast living room bookshelf, had automatically triggered a live high-definition audio and visual recording sequence perfectly on cue. I quickly moved the mouse and immediately clicked on the blinking red notification tab, instantly expanding the crystal-clear live video feed to fully cover the entire digital screen. Rachel and Derek were completely visible, sitting uncomfortably close together on the expensive white leather living room sofa. They were aggressively drinking from incredibly large, heavily poured glasses of dark red wine. Their previous celebratory, highly triumphant mood had completely, utterly vanished. Derek looked incredibly sick, deeply sweating, and severely trembling. Rachel stared blankly at her phone. I slowly leaned in, turning the computer speakers up, ready to hear my fate. The digital audio feed crackled to life, filling the quiet hotel suite with the ambient sounds of my own living room. I sat perfectly still in the ergonomic desk chair, my eyes glued to the bright computer monitor. Valerie remained seated directly across from me, her professional posture entirely rigid, completely silent, as we both watched the live surveillance footage unfold. On the high-definition screen, Derek was pacing frantically back and forth across the expensive Persian rug. His previous celebratory mood had entirely evaporated, replaced by a deep, terrifying paranoia. He dragged his trembling hands through his sweaty hair. His expensive white designer polo shirt was now visibly stained with dark patches of nervous sweat. Rachel sat perfectly still on the white leather sofa, holding a massive crystal glass filled to the very brim with dark red wine. She simply watched him pace with a blank, entirely hollow expression, looking completely unbothered by his sudden, chaotic panic. The stark contrast between his frantic, unraveling energy and her cold, reptilian calmness was incredibly disturbing to witness. The heavy silence stretched on for another agonizing minute, broken only by the sharp sound of Derek repeatedly scuffing his shoes against the floorboards. Finally, Derek stopped his relentless pacing and turned to face his wife. His chest was heaving with rapid, shallow breaths, his eyes darting nervously toward the large front windows, as if he expected the authorities to burst through the glass at any given second. He took a heavy, unsteady step toward the center of the room. "We are completely out of time, Rachel," he said, his voice trembling with a raw, undeniable desperation that echoed sharply through my computer speakers. "The primary investors are officially demanding a comprehensive audit of the company accounts by the end of this current week. If they see those massive negative balances, they are going to immediately report me to the federal authorities for corporate fraud. The syndicate is also breathing directly down my neck. They sent another highly encrypted message this morning. They want their principal payment immediately, or they are going to start breaking bones. We need that massive influx of cash right now." Rachel took a slow, deliberate sip from her crystal wine glass, her manicured fingers resting casually against the delicate stem. She did not even flinch at the horrifying mention of violent, dangerous criminals actively threatening their miserable, pathetic lives. "You need to calm down and trust the established plan." Derek, she replied smoothly, her voice completely devoid of any recognizable human emotion. Everything is moving exactly as we orchestrated. The old fool is currently sitting in a cheap rideshare blissfully on his way to the airport. He has absolutely no idea what is waiting for him. By tomorrow afternoon, he will be securely checked into the private desert facility. Once he crosses those highly secure front doors, he is entirely cut off from the outside world. He will not have access to a phone or a single working machine. Derek rubbed his pale face, looking incredibly nauseous. But what if the bank delays the reverse mortgage approval, he asked frantically. What if they require a mandatory physical inspection, or demand to speak with him directly before they officially release the funds into our joint account? We cannot afford a single bureaucratic delay. The syndicate will not wait another month for their money. They do not care about real estate closing timelines. They only care about cold, hard cash. Rachel let out a sharp, highly patronizing sigh, rolling her dark eyes as if she were speaking to a small child. You are panicking over absolutely nothing, she stated coldly. The forged paperwork is already processed, and the private appraiser you bribed has already submitted the inflated property valuation to the central underwriter. As soon as the old man is fully sedated in Mexico, the resident doctor will officially sign the medical incompetence form. It is a completely airtight, heavily tested system. They specialize in completely erasing difficult relatives. Once that specific medical document is officially filed with the state court, the forged power of attorney becomes absolute, undeniable law. We get the house entirely free and clear by this Friday, and when he finally croaks from all those heavy chemical sedatives, we take the massive life insurance policy too, Derek added, his voice dropping to a sinister, conspiratorial whisper. We will have enough liquid capital to completely pay off the violent syndicate, settle the angry investors, and permanently secure our entire financial future. He will simply be a tragic, incredibly sad statistic, a lonely old man whose mind tragically failed him in his final years. It is the perfect, untraceable crime. Nobody will ever question a devoted daughter making difficult medical decisions for her severely ailing, mentally incompetent, elderly father. I sat in the darkened hotel suite staring at the bright computer monitor with a terrifying, absolute clarity. The sheer, unadulterated evil radiating from their whispered conversation completely paralyzed my lungs. I had spent my entire adult life providing for that woman. I had completely sacrificed my own personal dreams to ensure she never experienced a single moment of financial hardship. I had paid for her elite education, funded her extravagant lifestyle, and welcomed her arrogant husband into my home with open arms. I had loved her with every single ounce of my beating heart, and this was my reward. Rachel did not flinch at the horrific casual mention of my impending chemically induced death. She simply raised her crystal glass toward the ceiling in a silent, mocking toast. He lived long enough, she replied coldly, her voice echoing through the hotel room like a sharp, rusted blade scraping against solid steel. It is our turn now. He had his time in the sun, and now it is incredibly greedy for him to hoard all that useless wealth while we are struggling to build our own empire. He owes us this final, ultimate sacrifice. It is only fair, dear Derek. Those 10 devastating words completely severed the final fraying thread of my enduring parental devotion. He lived long enough. It is our turn now. The agonizing, suffocating grief that had been heavily crushing my chest for the past 2 days instantly, permanently evaporated. The loving, endlessly forgiving father, who had desperately hoped for a peaceful, amicable resolution, died completely in that exact freezing moment. The profound sorrow was entirely replaced by an incredibly pure, highly concentrated, and utterly terrifying wrath. It was a dark, icy, and incredibly sharp fury that fundamentally altered the very chemistry of my rapidly pumping blood. I reached forward with a remarkably steady hand and deliberately pressed the power button on the computer keyboard. I slowly pushed the heavy laptop screen down, closing the machine with a firm, highly satisfying click. The bright video feed instantly vanished, plunging the luxurious hotel suite back into deep, heavy shadows. The suffocating silence rushed back into the room, broken only by the steady, rhythmic breathing of the powerful wealth manager sitting directly across from my desk. Valerie had not moved a single muscle during the entire horrifying recording. She simply sat there watching my total psychological transformation fully unfold. I slowly turned my head and looked directly into her sharp, highly observant gray eyes. The atmosphere in the room was incredibly tense, heavy with the undeniable promise of absolute catastrophic retribution. "We are no longer simply executing a defensive financial maneuver," I stated, my voice echoing with a dark, metallic resonance that commanded absolute, unquestioning obedience. "This is no longer about quietly protecting my assets or gently teaching them a difficult life lesson. They have aggressively declared absolute total war against my very existence, and I am going to systematically burn their entire world to the damn barren ground." Valerie slowly opened her premium leather briefcase, her professional demeanor completely masking the terrifying power she was about to unleash upon my enemies. She pulled out a pristine legal pad and a solid gold pen ready to precisely document my ultimate commands. "I want you to immediately contact your most ruthless, highly aggressive corporate investigators," I instructed smoothly. "I want them to aggressively infiltrate the dark financial underbelly of Derek's failing technology company. I want them to locate the exact criminal syndicate holding his massive $10 million debt. We are going to completely execute a very hostile financial takeover. Find the violent men who currently own his pathetic life," I concluded, my eyes entirely devoid of any lingering human mercy. "Offer them double the principal value of his illegal loans in untraceable offshore capital. I do not care how much it costs. I do not care how incredibly complicated the international wire transfers must be. Do absolutely whatever it takes to secure those specific promissory notes before the sun officially rises over the Seattle skyline tomorrow morning. Buy his debt. Own his miserable life. I want to personally crush him under the absolute undeniable weight of my vast fortune." Valerie did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. She immediately reached for her encrypted smartphone and began issuing a rapid series of highly complex commands to her elite financial team. The luxurious hotel suite instantly transformed into a high-tech operational war room. My explicit order to buy the massive criminal debt was not a simple transaction. It required an incredibly sophisticated web of anonymous offshore shell companies to completely obscure my personal identity. Valerie worked with absolute precision, utilizing her vast global network to securely isolate the specific syndicate holding Derek and his pathetic tech startup. Over the next 48 hours, I remained securely confined within the heavy walls of my downtown suite. I hardly slept, sustained only by cold coffee and the burning, singular desire for absolute retribution. Valerie orchestrated the massive capital transfer from my private $45 million portfolio. Her highly skilled corporate mercenaries successfully established direct contact with the violent underground lenders. The syndicate was initially suspicious of the sudden buyout offer, but the promise of an immediate untraceable $10 million cash settlement quickly erased any lingering hesitation. The ruthless criminals were more than happy to completely walk away. The complex financial maneuver was executed flawlessly under the dark cover of night. $10 million smoothly vanished from my newly established offshore holding account and instantly appeared within the untraceable crypto ledgers maintained by the criminal syndicate. In direct exchange for this massive liquid payout, the anonymous lenders officially transferred every single legal right, highly toxic promissory note, and incredibly dangerous contract directly over to Valerie and her designated corporate proxies. The heavy, terrifying burden of debt that had been violently suffocating my son-in-law was no longer held by the dangerous Seattle underground. It belonged to me. By purchasing that specific criminal debt, my offshore corporation legally absorbed every single piece of collateral Derek had desperately pledged to the violent mob. I watched with grim satisfaction as Valerie carefully laid the newly acquired legal documents across the solid oak desk. I was now the sole legal owner of his entire failing technology startup. Every patent, every server, and every empty office lease belonged entirely to my private portfolio. Furthermore, the toxic debt transfer included absolute legal claims to his personal luxury vehicles, his drained bank accounts, and even his highly leveraged commercial business loans and minor properties. But the most incredibly satisfying piece of collateral was buried deeply within the third file folder Valerie handed me. Derek had been so incredibly desperate to appease the violent loan sharks that he had proactively used the forged legal documents to secretly pledge the pending reverse mortgage on my Seattle home directly to the syndicate. By officially purchasing his $10 million mob debt, I had effectively bought the exact fraudulent mortgage back from the underground lenders. The incredibly dark irony was absolutely magnificent. Derek believed he was stealing my home, but he had merely handed it back to me. I was now officially his sole owner and his absolute primary creditor. If he failed to make a single payment, I had the supreme legal authority to completely seize everything he possessed and send him directly to a federal prison. He was entirely at my absolute mercy, completely unaware that the very man he had so ruthlessly attempted to lock away in a chemical desert prison was now the hidden master pulling all the strings. The transition of power was entirely seamless, a brutally efficient corporate execution carried out in the silent, invisible realms of high-level global dark finance. Valerie confidently sipped her dark coffee as she watched my intense reaction to the newly finalized contracts. "We have effectively placed an invisible financial noose directly around his neck," she stated softly, her voice carrying a deep note of profound professional satisfaction. "The violent loan sharks have been entirely paid off and removed from the active board. Your offshore holding company is now the singular entity controlling Derek and his miserable life. We can completely destroy him with a single phone call whenever you are finally ready to comfortably pull the very fragile rug directly out from under his feet." I nodded slowly, feeling a cold, deeply calculated sense of absolute victory radiating through my tired veins. I turned my attention back to the glowing screen of my encrypted laptop. The live surveillance feeds from my Seattle home were still running continuously in the background. It had been nearly 48 hours since I first initiated the aggressive corporate takeover. During that entire time, Rachel and Derek had continued packing my personal belongings into cheap garbage bags, completely erasing my long history from the house. They remained blissfully ignorant of the massive legal tidal wave rapidly approaching their doomed shores. Suddenly, the high-definition camera mounted inside the living room captured a frantic burst of extremely loud activity. Derek burst through the heavy wooden front door, his expensive designer dress shoes echoing wildly against the newly polished hardwood floors. He was breathing heavily, his face flushed with an incredibly bright, highly chaotic energy. He violently threw his leather briefcase onto the white sofa and let out a massive, triumphant shout that shook the camera microphone. Rachel immediately emerged from the pristine kitchen, holding a fresh glass of expensive red wine, looking incredibly startled by his sudden loud and chaotic entrance. "We are saved, Rachel!" Derek yelled at the top of his lungs, grabbing her entirely by the shoulders and spinning her wildly in a tight, joyous circle. A mysterious billionaire investor just bailed out the entire company. Someone completely anonymous just purchased every single penny of my toxic debt from the violent underground syndicate. The loan sharks are entirely gone, completely paid off in full. They sent me an official notification of release just 5 minutes ago. We are entirely free from the mob. We officially have our perfect, beautiful lives entirely back under our own total, personal, absolute control. Rachel stared at him with wide, incredibly shocked eyes, the expensive red wine spilling slightly over the delicate rim of her crystal glass and staining her manicured fingers. She quickly set the heavy glass down on the glass coffee table and let out a loud, piercing scream of pure, unadulterated joy. She threw her arms tightly around his neck, laughing, with an incredibly manic, completely relieved energy. "Are you absolutely serious, Derek?" she asked, her voice cracking with incredibly high, hysterical emotion. Did the massive reverse mortgage from my pathetic father finally clear the bank underwriter this very late afternoon? Derek shook his head, a massive, incredibly arrogant smirk, completely taking over his entire face. We do not even need the miserable old man or his stupid reverse mortgage anymore, he declared proudly, pouring himself a massive glass of wine. This incredibly wealthy, totally anonymous savior simply swooped in and bought the entire debt portfolio without asking a single difficult question. They clearly saw the massive, undeniable potential in my brilliant software company. I always knew my unparalleled business genius would eventually attract a major high-level institutional investor. We are going to be incredibly rich, Rachel. Unbelievably filthy rich. I sat in the dark hotel suite listening to my son-in-law loudly praise his own utterly fabricated genius. He honestly believed a legitimate billionaire had recognized his deeply flawed, totally empty business model and decided to save him out of pure professional admiration. His monumental arrogance completely blinded him to the incredibly obvious trap I had just mercilessly snapped shut around his fragile ankles. He was celebrating his ultimate salvation, while entirely ignoring the heavy invisible chains now firmly binding him directly to my offshore holding company. He was literally dancing joyously upon his own freshly dug grave. Rachel excitedly grabbed her expensive smartphone from the glass table, her fingers tapping rapidly across the glowing digital screen. "We absolutely must celebrate this monumental victory tonight," she declared, her voice echoing loudly with extreme, highly toxic excitement. "I am going to immediately call the most exclusive luxury catering company in the entire downtown Seattle area. We will host an incredibly lavish, highly expensive party right here in this beautiful house to properly celebrate our massive financial salvation. We can officially invite all of your pretentious venture capital friends and finally show them you are a massive, undeniable corporate success." Derek enthusiastically agreed, pulling his beautiful wife into another tight, highly passionate embrace as they continued to loudly plan their incredibly expensive, highly premature victory celebration. I sat in the dark shadows of the luxurious hotel suite, a cold, incredibly sharp smile finally breaking across my deeply tired, highly strained face. They were excitedly preparing to host a lavish, incredibly expensive party inside the very house they falsely believed they had successfully stolen from me. They had absolutely no idea the mysterious billionaire savior they were so happily toasting was the exact same old man they had brutally, permanently discarded. The following 48 hours passed in a blur of meticulous preparation and absolute deafening silence. While Derek and Rachel frantically organized their lavish victory celebration, Valerie and her elite legal team finalized every single piece of documentation required to completely secure my new position as their sole creditor and absolute owner. I remained inside the luxurious hotel suite, completely ignoring the live surveillance feeds. I no longer needed to watch them gloat. I already knew exactly how their arrogant story was going to end. By Saturday evening, the heavy Seattle rain had returned, slicking the dark suburban streets and reflecting the glowing city lights. I stood in front of the expansive mirror, quietly observing my own physical transformation. The faded tan jacket, the worn orthopedic shoes, and the moth-eaten sweaters were gone discarded in the hotel trash bin. In their place, I wore a bespoke dark charcoal Italian suit flawlessly tailored to fit my frame with absolute precision. A crisp white shirt and a deep crimson silk tie completed the powerful ensemble. I looked like a man who commanded absolute authority, the executioner my treacherous family so desperately deserved. Valerie stood waiting near the suite entrance, wearing a sharp black business dress and holding the thick leather binder that contained our newly acquired corporate instruments. We rode the private elevator down to the grand lobby in complete silence. A sleek, armored black SUV was idling perfectly at the curb, its heavily tinted windows completely obscuring the interior. As the uniformed valet opened the heavy door for me, I stepped inside and immediately acknowledged the two massive, highly trained private security contractors sitting stoically in the third row. They wore tactical dark suits, discreet communication earpieces, and clearly visible sidearms securely holstered at their waists. They were strictly instructed to maintain absolute order and ensure no one interfered with my legal right to reclaim my property. The short drive to my quiet neighborhood felt incredibly surreal. As the heavy vehicle turned onto my familiar suburban street, the sheer scale of Rachel and Derek's premature celebration became immediately apparent. The entire block was lined with expensive luxury vehicles. Two large catering vans were illegally parked across my manicured front lawn, crushing the delicate hydrangeas I had planted with my late wife. A temporary valet station had been erected near my mailbox, managed by young men in crisp white uniforms, taking keys from arriving guests. The rhythmic thumping bass of incredibly loud electronic dance music vibrated heavily through the damp evening air, shaking the glass of my front windows. They were throwing a massive rave inside the very home they had fraudulently stolen, funded entirely by the imaginary grace of a fictional billionaire savior. The armored SUV smoothly pulled up to the end of the long driveway, completely blocking the busy valet lane. The lead parking attendant rushed forward, waving a red glowing wand and shouting for us to instantly move the vehicle. My two security contractors stepped out first, their massive physical presence instantly silencing the highly frustrated young man. Valerie emerged next, clutching the thick leather binder tightly against her chest. I was the last to step out into the cool, damp night. I buttoned my suit jacket, took a deep breath, and began the short walk up my concrete driveway. The front double doors of my home were propped wide open to accommodate the massive flow of loudly laughing guests. I easily recognized several of Derek's venture capital friends' young men, wearing expensive watches holding crystal flutes of premium champagne. They were clustered around the brightly lit entryway, loudly boasting about their fictional stock portfolios and imaginary corporate conquests. They briefly glanced at me, their eyes sliding right past my face before suddenly snapping back, completely confused by my authoritative entrance. I did not slow my deliberate pace. I marched directly through the grand double doors, heavily flanked on either side by the massive security contractors, with Valerie walking precisely one step behind my right shoulder. The interior of the house was completely unrecognizable. The soft, warm lighting had been entirely replaced by harsh, rapidly pulsing, colored lasers. The heavy antique furniture had been aggressively pushed against the walls to create a massive dance floor in the living room. The air was incredibly thick, with the scent of catered food, spilled alcohol, and designer cologne. Over 200 people were tightly crammed into my personal space, shouting over the deafeningly loud music. I gave a slight nod to the security contractor walking on my left. He immediately stepped forward, reached directly over a highly surprised party guest, and violently yanked the primary audio cable straight out of the DJ mixing board. The loud thumping music cut out instantly, leaving a jarring, incredibly awkward silence in its sudden wake. The sudden absence of sound caused a massive ripple of severe confusion to spread rapidly across the crowded room. 200 heads turned simultaneously toward the front entryway, their annoyed expressions quickly faltering as they clearly registered the deeply serious presence of my armed escort. The thick, drunken chatter slowly died down to a nervous, heavily echoing whisper. The dense sea of pretentious guests instinctively began to part, stepping backward to create a wide path leading directly to the center of the spacious room. And there, standing right next to the long, catered dining table, were Rachel and Derek. They were holding court, completely surrounded by a small group of highly sycophantic admirers. Rachel was wearing a stunning silver sequined designer dress that caught the remaining ambient light, making her look like a shimmering beacon of stolen wealth. Derek stood proudly beside her, wearing a smug smile, holding a freshly opened bottle of premium vintage champagne in his left hand. He was actively mid-sentence, loudly bragging to the crowd about his brilliant business acumen when he finally noticed the sudden silence that had overtaken his lavish party. He slowly turned his head, his annoyed gaze sweeping across the actively parted crowd, until his eyes completely locked onto mine. The arrogant, triumphant smirk instantly froze on his face. It did not fade gracefully. It simply shattered exactly like brittle glass violently struck by a heavy steel hammer. He blinked rapidly, his jaw going entirely slack, as his severely panicked brain violently struggled to process the absolutely impossible image standing directly inside his living room. He was looking at the exact man he firmly believed was heavily sedated and permanently locked away inside a highly corrupt desert psychiatric ward. Furthermore, he was not looking at a broken, defeated, terribly dressed old man. He was staring directly at a powerful, impeccably tailored titan, flanked by armed professional guards. Rachel slowly followed her husband's completely terrified gaze. Her dark eyes widened to an impossible, almost comical degree. The rich color instantly drained from her cheeks, leaving her face a stark, horrifying shade of ghostly white. Her manicured fingers went completely, totally numb. The expensive crystal champagne glass slipped directly through her paralyzed grasp. It fell in absolute slow motion, striking the newly polished hardwood floor with a sharp, incredibly violent crash. The delicate crystal shattered into 1,000 jagged fragments, sending a large spray of expensive sparkling wine completely across the delicate tips of her silver designer shoes. The sharp sound of the breaking glass echoed like a loud gunshot through the perfectly silent, utterly terrified room. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The 200 wealthy guests simply stood frozen, completely captivated by the horrifying, undeniable tension actively suffocating the heavy atmosphere. I slowly walked forward, my expensive leather shoes crunching softly over the shattered crystal fragments scattered across the sticky floor. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from my highly treacherous daughter and her completely paralyzed husband. The sheer terror radiating from their rapidly trembling bodies was incredibly palpable. Derek opened his mouth desperately, trying to formulate a single coherent thought, but only a pathetic, raspy wheeze managed to safely escape his completely dry throat. He swallowed incredibly hard, his terrified eyes darting frantically between my custom Italian suit, Valerie's cold, professional glare, and the 2 massive security guards looming directly behind me. "Victor," he finally managed to stammer, his voice painfully cracking, with a high, incredibly pathetic squeak of pure, unfiltered panic. You are supposed to be in New Mexico." I stood perfectly straight, my posture entirely rigid, completely radiating absolute, unyielding power. A slow, incredibly cold, and entirely merciless smile spread across my face. I reached my right hand back without breaking eye contact. Valerie immediately placed the thick, heavy black leather binder directly into my waiting palm. The thick binder contained every single toxic promissory note, every criminal debt contract, and the absolute legal deed to the very house they were currently standing in. I held the heavy binder up for a brief, agonizing second, letting him clearly see the terrifying weight of his own impending destruction. Then, with a smooth, completely calculated motion, I violently tossed the thick leather binder directly onto the glass dining table. The heavy leather binder landed on the pristine glass surface with a resounding, authoritative thud that seemed to shake the very foundation of the room. 200 pairs of eyes were completely locked onto my movements. The collective breath of Seattle's supposed elite held in absolute terrified suspense. Valerie stepped smoothly to my side, her posture perfectly straight, while my 2 massive security contractors shifted slightly, creating an impenetrable physical barrier between myself and the shocked party guests. I slowly flipped open the thick leather cover of the binder. The pristine, heavily notarized documents inside represented the absolute totality of their financial and moral ruin. I pulled out the first sheet of high bond paper and held it up for Derek to clearly see. "This," I announced, my voice carrying effortlessly across the perfectly silent room, "is a highly detailed, legally verified copy of a forged power of attorney. It is the exact document you and my treacherous daughter illegally fabricated to steal the equity from my home. You mistakenly believed I was a senile, pathetic old man, incapable of defending myself against your desperate greed." I calmly placed the forged document back onto the table and pulled out a second, much thicker stack of heavily stamped legal papers. "You assumed my entire net worth was tied to this single piece of suburban real estate. I continued, my tone dropping to a dangerous, icy register. Exactly 2 months ago, I inherited a staggering $45 million in premium tech stocks from a late business associate. I had meticulously hired top wealth managers to establish a generational trust fund to ensure your entire family would never face a single day of financial hardship. Rachel let out a small, highly pathetic whimper, her hands flying to cover her mouth. The profound, sickening realization that she had actively thrown away a massive guaranteed $45 million fortune for a pathetic, fraudulent reverse mortgage visibly struck her like a physical blow. "But your husband could not wait," I stated, turning my piercing gaze entirely back onto Derek. "His fraudulent technology startup is nothing more than a massive, rapidly collapsing Ponzi scheme. You defrauded your investors, you squandered their capital on luxury cars and expensive champagne, and when the money finally ran out, you desperately borrowed $10 million from a ruthless syndicate of violent, unforgiving loan sharks." The whispering among the party guests instantly ignited into a loud, incredibly frantic murmur. The security contractors immediately raised their hands, forming a solid wall to hold the angry investors back. "You thought a mysterious billionaire savior miraculously swooped in to purchase your massive criminal debt today," I said, leaning slightly across the glass dining table. I reached into the binder and pulled out the original, highly toxic promissory notes, bearing Derek's frantic signature. "I am that mysterious billionaire Derek. I used a fraction of my newly acquired wealth to aggressively purchase every single piece of your illegal debt through an untraceable offshore holding company." Derek stumbled backward, his back hitting the dining room wall with a heavy, resounding thud. He looked absolutely destroyed, his entire fabricated world collapsing into a pile of worthless ashes as the horrific realization of his total, inescapable defeat finally washed over his intensely sweating face. "I own your company, Derek," I announced, delivering the final, absolutely crushing blow with perfect, merciless clarity. "I own this house. And as of 5 minutes ago, I canceled the reverse mortgage. You are bankrupt, trespassing, and guilty of federal fraud." Rachel could no longer physically support her own weight. She collapsed entirely, falling hard onto her bare knees amidst the sharp, broken fragments of her shattered champagne glass. The sharp crystal bit into her skin, but she did not even seem to notice the physical pain. Tears streamed rapidly down her perfectly made-up face, ruining her expensive cosmetics in thick, dark streaks. She crawled desperately across the hardwood floor, reaching her trembling, manicured hands out toward the hem of my tailored Italian trousers. "Daddy, please!" she sobbed, her voice breaking into a high, hysterical wail of pure desperation. "Please, Daddy, you have to listen to me. I am so incredibly sorry. I did not know what he was doing. Derek lied to me about the money. He manipulated me into signing those papers. I never wanted to hurt you. And that terrible facility in New Mexico, I swear to God, I had absolutely no idea they used heavy chemical sedatives. I thought it was a peaceful, beautiful resort. I thought I was getting you the best medical help available. Please, Daddy, you have to forgive me. I am your little girl." She wept openly, her face buried in her trembling hands, presenting the perfect, highly practiced image of a deeply remorseful, entirely innocent victim. I would have rushed forward, pulled her into my arms, and forgiven absolutely every single transgression to protect my only child. But I was no longer that blind, devoted man. I looked down at her weeping form with absolute, unyielding coldness. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my heavy, encrypted smartphone. I did not say a single word. I simply unlocked the digital screen, navigated to the secure audio files, and pressed the play button. I held the powerful speaker up so the entire room could hear it perfectly. The crystal-clear audio recording from the hidden living room camera instantly filled the expansive space. Rachel's own voice, cold, calculating, and devoid of human empathy, echoed loudly over the heads of the shocked party guests. "He lived long enough. It is our turn now." The recording stopped. The final echoing syllable hung heavily in the damp Seattle air. The devastating contradiction between the weeping daughter kneeling on the floor and the ruthless monster captured on the audio file was undeniable. Rachel instantly froze. The hysterical sobbing abruptly stopped, caught completely dead in her throat. She slowly raised her head, looking up at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. She finally realized that the charming mask she had worn her entire life had been permanently ripped away in front of her social circle. Every single person in that room now knew exactly what she was. The entire room went completely, utterly dead silent. Nobody whispered. Nobody moved. The profound gravity of her ultimate betrayal was incredibly suffocating. I slowly lowered the smartphone and slipped it back into my pocket. My lingering grief, the final painful remnants of my shattered parental love, evaporated completely into the cold night air. It was entirely replaced by an icy, heavily calculated, and deeply satisfying wrath. I had laid the perfect trap, and they had foolishly walked directly into the steel jaws. I turned my head slightly, looking over my shoulder at Valerie. She stood perfectly poised, her sharp gray eyes calmly surveying the absolute devastation we had successfully orchestrated. I gave her a single definitive nod. "Call the federal authorities," I commanded smoothly, my voice devoid of mercy. "Tell them we have a corporate fraud case ready for prosecution. And call the local police. I want these trespassers removed from my property." The heavy silence that had suffocated my living room was suddenly broken by the faint, rapidly approaching wail of multiple sirens. The piercing sound cut through the damp Seattle night, growing louder and more intense with every passing second. The 200 wealthy guests exchanged nervous, terrified glances, instinctively backing further away from Derek and Rachel, as if their sudden misfortune were a highly contagious disease. Valerie stood calmly by my side, her phone resting quietly in her hand. She had seamlessly coordinated with her federal contacts hours ago, meticulously preparing this exact moment of absolute justice. The flashing red and blue lights began to bounce aggressively against the large front windows, casting frantic, colorful shadows across the polished hardwood floors and the shattered crystal fragments. Heavy, authoritative footsteps echoed loudly on the front porch. The grand double doors already pushed wide open for the lavish, catered party easily permitted the immediate entrance of 6 armed federal agents. They moved with absolute terrifying precision, their dark tactical windbreakers displaying bold yellow letters that read FBI across the back. The local Seattle police closely followed them, moving quickly to secure the perimeter and block the long driveway, ensuring absolutely no one could escape the impending legal reckoning. The lead federal agent, a tall, incredibly imposing man with a stern, deeply weathered face, marched directly into the center of the spacious living room. He completely ignored the sea of terrified party guests in their expensive designer clothing. His sharp gaze locked instantly onto my heavily sweating, violently trembling son-in-law. Derek took a clumsy, incredibly weak step backward, his expensive leather dress shoes slipping slightly against the spilled champagne. He raised his shaking hands in a pathetic, deeply cowardly gesture of surrender. The harsh reality of his inevitable situation completely crushed whatever pathetic arrogance he still harbored in his failing mind. The lead agent did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He reached to his tactical belt, retrieving a pair of heavy steel handcuffs that rattled sharply in the tense air. Derek Mitchell, the agent, announced, his deep voice projecting absolute, undeniable authority over the entire terrified crowd. "You are officially under arrest for multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, severe corporate embezzlement, and the deliberate, highly illegal forgery of legal documents. You have the right to remain entirely silent. I highly suggest you actively use it." The federal agents moved swiftly, forcefully, grabbing Derek by his trembling shoulders and spinning him roughly around to face the wall. The sharp, incredibly satisfying click of the heavy steel cuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed like a loud drumbeat of ultimate justice. Derek began to weep openly, a pathetic, highly humiliating sound that completely shattered his carefully cultivated image of a powerful, untouchable billionaire entrepreneur. He sobbed uncontrollably as the agents ruthlessly patted him down completely, ignoring his frantic, totally incoherent pleas for mercy. The venture capital friends he had so desperately tried to impress simply stood there in stunned silence, actively watching the total destruction of a fraud. The agents gripped his arms firmly and began marching him directly toward the front doors. Derek dragged his feet, his head hanging in absolute shame, looking like a broken, entirely defeated criminal as he was forcefully dragged out into the flashing lights of the damp Seattle night. With Derek permanently removed from the active equation, I slowly turned my undivided attention back to the weeping woman kneeling pathetically on the floor. Rachel was still completely paralyzed by fear, her dark eyes entirely locked onto the empty doorway where her fraudulent husband had just violently disappeared. The massive crowd of terrified guests began to slowly, nervously shuffle toward the exit, desperately eager to completely distance themselves from this massive legal disaster. I did not stop them. I simply watched them scramble out of my beautiful home, leaving Rachel entirely alone, completely stripped of her superficial audience and her toxic social power. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, looking down at the incredibly selfish, entirely hollow woman I had mistakenly raised. She slowly looked up at me, her face completely stained with dark mascara and fresh, bitter tears. "Daddy," she whispered weakly, her voice completely devoid of its usual arrogant command. "I have absolutely nowhere to go. My bank accounts are totally frozen. My husband is going to federal prison. Please, you cannot simply throw me out into the street." I reached deep into the inner pocket of my custom-tailored Italian suit jacket. My fingers smoothly traced the edge of a small, stiff piece of printed paper I had intentionally carried with me for this exact, highly anticipated moment. I slowly pulled out the cheap, heavily discounted bus ticket to the remote New Mexico desert facility. It was the exact same piece of paper Derek had forcefully shoved into my hands just a few short hours ago. I held it up, letting her clearly see the final destination printed in bold black ink. "You deliberately bought me a cheap one-way ticket to a brutal chemical prison." "Rachel," I stated coldly, my voice echoing with a dark, completely unyielding finality, "you actively planned to permanently erase my mind and forcefully lock me away until the day I tragically died." I slowly opened my fingers, letting the small paper ticket flutter gently down through the heavy air until it landed directly onto the sticky hardwood floor, resting just inches away from her trembling knees. "Now it is time for you to leave. Do not ever attempt to contact me again." The passage of time often acts as a remarkably powerful healing agent, rapidly washing away the bitter, toxic residue of profound betrayal. Exactly 3 months passed since that incredibly dark, highly satisfying night of absolute justice. The heavy Seattle rain had finally surrendered to a bright, beautifully crisp spring morning. I stood silently inside the grand sunlit lobby of a towering, newly renovated corporate building located directly in the bustling heart of the financial district. The expansive marble walls were proudly decorated with bold, solid brass lettering that clearly read the Warren Mitchell Foundation for Elder Legal Protection. Using a substantial portion of my massive $45 million tech stock portfolio, I had successfully established this premier, highly aggressive legal aid organization. We employed the most brilliant, incredibly ruthless attorneys to specifically defend vulnerable senior citizens from the exact type of predatory financial abuse my treacherous family had attempted to inflict upon me. I was no longer a hidden, completely forgotten victim, quietly waiting for the inevitable end. I was a powerful, fiercely protective guardian, actively shielding those who could not protect themselves. I slowly raised my hands, looking deeply at the thick, rough calluses I had earned from decades of incredibly hard, highly honest labor. The deep, agonizing sorrow that had previously weighed so heavily upon my tired soul was permanently, completely gone. My strong hands were no longer full of terrible grief or profound regret. They were completely full of a renewed, incredibly powerful sense of absolute purpose. I softly smiled as the bright morning sun completely illuminated the grand lobby, and the screen slowly faded to black. Life is full of hidden truths, and sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who create them. The greatest lesson is to never ignore your instincts when something feels wrong. Words can be used to hide deception, but actions will always reveal the truth. Blind forgiveness is not love, it is self-destruction. Stay alert, protect yourself, safeguard your assets, and never compromise your core values. If this story touched you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel today so you won't miss our upcoming stories and thought-provoking dramas. Have you ever experienced betrayal? Share your experience and thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my father's daughter, and I always will remain through every triumph, every loss.